delighted to be here. And to Gail's point, I'd much rather be seeing you in person, but that's okay. I'll settle for this venue because it probably means that more of us are here than could be together otherwise. And thank you again for the introduction and for the invitation to be part of this conversation and dialogue. Before I get started, I want to acknowledge that where our campus is situated and my home, where I am joining you via Zoom, is located in the traditional homelands of the Massachusetts people. They are one of many indigenous peoples to the Commonwealth, but the one for whom the Commonwealth is named. And I do hope that as we work our way through this presentation, very broad strokes, I'm going to use to talk about Indigenous peoples of this place and surrounding sister nations of the Massachusetts, like the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag. I do hope that you'll have some questions, comments, conversations for me at the end. But the area we're at is also referred to as the Dawnland by Wabanaki people, and very similar term of Wampanoag, Wampanu, for the Wampanoag peoples as well. So peoples of the East might be another way to think about this. I also want to provide some context as to who I am and how I ended up here, because some of you who know me know that I am not from Massachusetts and certainly not from Boston originally. I am Lumbee. My tribe is from North Carolina, which is about 800 miles from here, my tribal homelands. And we are one of 8 tribes in the state. And here's a historic image of some of my great uncles participating in what was called the Red Man's Lodge circa 1914. Interesting stories in and of itself tied to that. I, like a lot of other Native people, have been calling this region home myself for 25 years now, and here in Boston for the last 6 years prior to that in Connecticut and Weymouth, Mass as well. But what many Americans know today about Indigenous peoples here is either linked to origin myths of Thanksgiving, Indian raids, conflict with Native peoples, whether at Deerfield or King Philip's War, casinos, or our mascots in Massachusetts, which just don't ever seem to go away. Although I am delighted to say that the one that is one of the more offensive ones, the North Quincy Red Raiders, went away last year. So progress is possible.
Awesome.
When we look at who was in Massachusetts, what we think of as the Commonwealth historically, as well as Indigenous peoples today, it was a diverse community. Not all Native peoples were from the same tribe or national affiliation, even though they all spoke closely related languages, whether we're talking about Massachusetts, Nipmuc, Wampanoag, Pennacook, Pocumtuck, Narragansett, Mohegan Pequot, all spoke languages tied into the Algonquin language family, a language family that extends on the East Coast from the subarctic all the way down to North Carolina. And as you can see, where Boston is at is clearly in Massachusetts territory. And whether we're thinking of Southern New England or Northern New England, these Native nations span both sides of the Canadian-US border, whether we're talking about the Mi'kmaq, the Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy, all have villages and traditional communities on both sides of this border. I like to say, and my students probably get tired of me saying it, that we didn't cross the border crossed us. But these are all Indigenous spaces important to us. And these communities also in Northern New England are part of that very large Algonquin language family. And there has been long-standing movement for centuries and centuries, predating the arrival of the English in this area, between these communities. One of the first people that the Puritans that we think of today as the inhabitants, the original English colonists at the Patuxent, which is now Plymouth, one of the first people they encountered was Samoset. Samoset was not a Wampanoag, but in fact was a Wabanaki sachem from the territory you're seeing now, and he already spoke English, uh, definitely pointing to extended interaction with English and French people outside of Massachusetts before his arrival to visit his relatives. When we think of indigenous peoples here, the stereotype is that native peoples lived in teepees. Well, not in New England. Whether we're talking about the Maritimes of Canada or southern New England, the housing forms were frequently made of mats, bulrush generally, or bark. So whether it's a summer wetu or a winter wetu, and whether they lived in villages or hamlets, some having palisaded fences for protection around them or not, indigenous home styles, lifeways very much are tied and reflective of the places they lived and utilized those resources. Native peoples here were, and some still are, very much farmers, hunters, and fishermen. This photo you see is of a Mashpee Wampanoag friend of mine working in a cornfield in what's called a Three Sisters garden: corn, beans, and squash. Integrated agricultural approaches provided reliable surplus foodstuffs on an ongoing basis, things that were very much important to indigenous peoples, and native women very much were the primary producers of agricultural foodstuffs as well as controllers of indigenous lands. So very different understandings and gender relationships here among regional native peoples and the English and French who would become their neighbors. What you see up above in this photo of native dancers leading a stomp dance is around a fish weir that's been constructed in Boston Common. Uh, it's a nod to two things. One, just how radically the geography of Boston has changed over time. There are places now that we think of as dry land, and we certainly can walk upon it, but those areas used to be underwater. And to drive home that point, in that green jar is part of a fish weir found in an area that is now a park, but at one point in time, native peoples were constructing these kind of weirs to fish. Native peoples relied on many things, not just corn, beans, and squash. Maple sugar, maple syrup, which I know I enjoy, is something native people have been making for probably thousands of years, or using a version of it. Sunflowers, strawberries, blueberries. The bounty of this land made life here uh, relatively easy in comparison to indigenous peoples elsewhere. And what you see up at the very top, that green leafy plant, some of you may know its more famous cousin. Here it's known colloquially as goosefoot or chenopodium, but it has a famous relative called quinoa, which you pay a whole lot of money for at health food stores. So native peoples, we even have our own indigenous version of chenopodium. And native peoples are celebrated for their clam bakes, for their traditional foodways, and certainly have been known as chefs, as cooks, and the originators of much of the food culture of our region. One of the reasons now that people like me need to continue to teach about native peoples is the catastrophic population loss that occurred here in this and other regions, largely through virgin soil epidemics. When we take a look at this, and this is the time period from around, say, 1600 to 1620, For Massachusetts, Wampanoag, Narragansett people, it's estimated that there was a mortality rate of around 86%. This is driven by exposure to diseases to which my ancestors and the ancestors of the people here had no natural immunity. These are diseases being brought over by the French in the very first virgin soil epidemics that hit what is now Massachusetts actually arrived before the Puritans did. And so we think based on that, that the disease vector actually came out of Canada and that the local Massachusetts Wampanoag Nipmuc peoples contracted the disease from trading with their relatives to the north in the Maritimes. This high mortality death rate was only exacerbated after sustained contact with a period of enslavement of native peoples and direct military confrontation as native peoples sought to maintain their homelands and life ways. But prior to military conflict, native people are diplomats by nature. And whether we're thinking of the Wabanaki, Huron, other peoples to the north, or native peoples on Long Island Sound, wampum or wampum-piak, which became actually legal tender in Connecticut colony, was an important way for native people to create new relatives, new kinship relationships, to navigate political confrontations, to end wars. So as diplomats, native peoples continued this practice, and the English, French, and later Americans picked it up to continue to engage with native people. Thomas Jefferson famously remarked, at least in indigenous studies, that two things either military leaders or diplomats always needed with them in engaging with various nations was tobacco and wampum, critical to native people's ceremonial life and diplomatic protocols. Now, I mentioned the terms indigenous slavery, native slavery, and most people are quite surprised, but it was a very lucrative venture. And following virtually every armed conflict between native peoples, and whether it be the Dutch, English, or French, frequently many of the surviving native peoples were enslaved and sold outside of whichever colony they happened to be enslaved in. Many native peoples from this region, following the Pequot War as well as King Philip's War, ended up in the British colony of Bermuda. Having said that, it also provides a really interesting perspective on how long indigenous memories are. The enslaved people of St. David's Island had been referred to for hundreds of years as the St. David's Island Indians. And it is for the reason of so many enslaved Nipmuc, Wampanoag, Pequot people ending up on that particular island, that they remembered the source of their ancestors and they remembered their homelands. And today, and this started back in 2000, I think 2010 was the first Reconnections Festival between native peoples here in St. David's Island. But now every other year, there is an intentional reconnection and a powwow, bringing traditional songs and dances from this place to St. David's Island, Bermuda, to reconnect these people that have been torn asunder via the transatlantic slave trade. Indigenous peoples here continued to adapt. They did not disappear, even though greatly diminished in terms of numbers, whether we are talking about the famous Narragansett stonemasons going all the way back to 1674. They learned new trades and ways to survive in these colonial contexts. And the best stonemasons, I would maintain, are still the Narragansett stonemasons of Rhode Island and neighboring towns. Many of the Massachusetts Indians also have Narragansett ancestry and also are stonemasons and have learned that trade from their neighbors and their kin. Whaling and fishing. important to Indigenous peoples before contact, very much important to Indigenous peoples today as they continue fights for sovereignty over shell fishing rights, eel fishing rights, and were quite famous in books like Moby Dick, which, while fictionalized, is very much based on some of the experiences of Wampanoag whalers. Persistence. This is the Cisco homestead on the Hissanamesco or Hissanamesset Reservation in Grafton, Mass. What is left of the 20,000 acres allocated to Nipmuc Native proprietors in that town. And it is under restoration. It's built in 1801. It's still standing, and the tribe is engaged both in active archaeology there to tell older stories of that place via material culture, but they are renovating it to serve as their tribal museum, and it is also the site of one of their ongoing powwows over the last many, many decades. Native people refusing to disappear, even though the policy, the economic forces push that to happen. Another example, whether we're talking about 1840 or 2013, Maliseet, Pequot, Nipmuc Native peoples using brown ash to make baskets and to use these baskets as ways to preserve cultural forms and practices, as well as ways to feed their families and to generate amazing artwork. Some of you I know are very familiar with Massachusetts history and know that what is now the state of Maine used to be the Eastern District of Massachusetts. So at that point in time, before there was a state of Maine, the Penobscot and Passamaquoddy actually had standing delegates to the Mass legislature. So the connections between those native peoples and the Commonwealth is a very deep one. And the Commonwealth even transferred money to the new state of Maine from the Passamaquoddy and the Penobscot funds. So if you look at some of the records, you get an understanding why there's such a large presence of Micmac or Mi'kmaq peoples here from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, as well as Maliseet, Penobscot, and Passamaquoddy peoples. Their history is a long-standing one. When we think about Native peoples, the term reservation frequently comes up. And as you have seen, we've gone through a pretty dramatic shift from where all of this was native lands to where natives have a few small parcels in comparison to their numbers. And frequently a few acres or a few hundred acres, although some tribes have been able to repurchase their lands, like at Mohegan and Mashantucket, and now have thousands of acres of land. And the Maine tribes have larger reservations than the tribes further south for a host of historic reasons that we can talk about, but also tied to the Maine Indian Land Claims Settlement Act. Being native in this region is not an easy thing. Tribes function as governments. They function as preservers of culture and traditions, as protectors of homelands, and very much as advocates. It is something that is an ongoing assumption that Native people are having to actively protest, battle, litigate protection of Indigenous rights. Whether it's fishing rights guaranteed by the English, reaffirmed by the Americans, but challenged by the various states in which they reside. I also want to drive home the point yet again that for Native peoples, having a Nipmuc chief Cheryl Holly or the Mohegan chief Lynn Malerba is not a new innovation for Native peoples here. It's a continuation of a very old tradition of recognizing the importance, the significance, the power that Native women bring to our communities. And some of these photos are outdated. Some of the leaders have changed. For example, it's also now Chief Clarissa Sabatis for the Maliseet. prior to Chief Sabatis, it was Chief Brenda Commander. So again, Native women leaders is more of the norm than an exception. To give you a little more detail in terms of tribes in contemporary Massachusetts, I have to break them down into multiple categories because unlike 1600, they have many different political statuses, and this difference in political statuses can drive which rights the Commonwealth or the federal government does or does not recognize. There are also now several nonprofit organizations in the Commonwealth, the oldest being the North American Indian Center of Boston, based in Jamaica Plain, 105 South Huntington Avenue. The next oldest, Massachusetts Center for Native American Awareness, based out of Danvers, Mass., but also Indian councils, Indian organizations established elsewhere. This is true in other states as well. In New York, you have the American Indian Community House. It's been around for a very long time. In Connecticut, the Connecticut Indian Council, the Rhode Island Indian Council, and these are tribes and nonprofits with whom I have worked to varying degrees in my 11 years at UMass Boston. In northern New England, Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire, there are no state or federally recognized tribes in New Hampshire, but there are 4 bands of state recognized Abenaki peoples in Vermont. And of course, we have the 4 federally recognized tribes in Maine, with the Passamaquoddy Indian tribe having 2 reservations and a council for each of those places. When we think about contemporary Indigenous Massachusetts, we think about diversity. That's the term I really want you to walk away with. Pulling from census reports and American Community Survey data up through 2016, there were about 50,000 self-identified American Indian Alaskan Native people. And if you compare that to the map to the left, there are a whole lot more tribal groupings than there were then. Now, granted, the map to the left is a simplification of these national territories of, say, the Wampanoag or the Nipmuc peoples, but still, we have thousands of Native peoples now who identify as their point of origin from South America, from Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras. So we have Mapuche, any number of different ethnic groups of Maya. We have Maya Quiche, Tzotzil Maya, Mam Maya, all present in the city of Boston. We have Quechua people from Ecuador present in the city of Boston. And we also have thousands of indigenous peoples from the other side of the international border, this territory, now the nation state of Canada. Both Haudenosaunee peoples who use the Jay Treaty for free passage back and forth, or alleged free passage, as well as many Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, Passamaquoddy peoples as well. And people like myself, Lumbee people from North Carolina. I'm actually not the only Lumbee in Boston, believe it or not. My tribe's quite large, and we end up in lots of different urban areas. So when we look at this diversity of indigenous peoples in the Commonwealth who were residents, that is also reflective of our indigenous students at UMass Boston. In the courses I teach, and I teach 1 class a semester, I have had people from all of the communities still present in Massachusetts, as well as indigenous students from the places I've mentioned, whether it's Canada, Guatemala, Honduras, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. So whether we are in Natick, looking at Spain Street, which is named after one of the original Natick native proprietors when it was the praying town of Natick, or whether we are looking at downtown Boston from the Blue Hills Reservation, or Deer Island, which we can see from our campus, which was a prisoner of war camp for Native peoples in King Philip's War. Also, another sad bit of history, the Massachusetts Exclusion and Imprisonment Act stayed on the books from 1675 to 2004. So Native peoples were not legally supposed to be in the city of Boston minus written consent and an armed escort. It was only pulled off the books of Boston when a National Minority Journalist Association was going to cancel their conference in the city because it was still present on the books. Sacred spaces such as the cliffs, the Gayhead Cliffs at Aquinnah, are still protected, still important to Indigenous peoples today. Here in the city, I'd mentioned the North American Indian Center of Boston. It's an important resource and way for urban Native peoples to make community. The Native peoples they serve are some Native peoples from local tribes, but far more are First Nations peoples from the Maritimes and other expatriate Native people like myself. Boston Indian Council was established in 1971, and it's one of the older urban Indian organizations that's still around. A lot have closed over the last several years. And Boston is also home to one of only 33 urban Indian health centers across the United States. Another significant point to understand how embedded the Native community is here in our home. Last but not least, these Native peoples who are relocating to Boston, to the Commonwealth from other places, are absolutely making connections with local Native communities. This is a photograph of a Mayaki Chase ceremony in Massachusetts, posted by some of the community members in a public venue, and it is on this ceremony is being held in the ceremonial space of a Massachusetts tribe that gave them permission to assemble there and to bring in their medicine person from Guatemala to conduct ritual, to remain connected to who they are as Indigenous peoples. And last but not least, this is a photograph from the last intertribal powwow we were able to do. I forget how many years ago now. It's not an easy thing to pull off, given our various bureaucratic structures, but something that when it's able to happen, I would say is very important. And so here in this photograph, you have Wabanaki people, you have Cree people, Potawatomi people, Navajo people, Wampanoag people, Taino people, all here in this photograph in one of our ballrooms on campus, celebrating community, celebrating being together, celebrating survival and persistence. Something that you all, as my dear staff colleagues, will want to think about, and we certainly can delve deeper into this conversation in part 2 of this. So what does this mean in terms of resources for our Native students or professional colleagues or faculty? It means that there are designated health resources for members of state or federally recognized tribes. And it varies dependent upon status, which one of these would be open to providing services for those individuals. It also means that there is a dedicated Workforce Investment Opportunity Act program for Native adults in the city, operated by NACOB. In addition to any number of Native nonprofit organizations like the Mass Center for Native American Awareness, who have as their whole goal the creation and fostering of Native community and education about Native peoples. It also means that even though we are not very visible or discernible in the very large population here at UMass Boston, there are specific financial resources externally funded for students at UMass Boston, as well as the Massachusetts tuition waiver, which is not need-based, which applies to any member of a state or federally recognized tribe or status First Nations person from Canada are all eligible for the mass tuition waiver as long as they are residents of the Commonwealth. This does not apply to University Without Walls, but just in-person instruction at any of the Mass state higher ed institutions at the undergraduate level. And I am going to be quiet because I hear myself talk all the time. And I talk about these things all the time, but I really want to hear what your reactions are, your experiences have been, or what questions you may have for me in my role at the university or my prior experiences to coming here. I've been a native student at 3 different academic institutions: University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, University of Arizona, Tucson, and University of Connecticut. So I'm happy to talk about any of those.